And joining me now in the studio is Associate Professor Brendon O'Connor of the US Studies Centre at Sydney University. Professor Brendon O'Connor, welcome.
Nice to be here.
By delaying this visit, does that indicate some desperation in the White House over this healthcare reform?
No, it could mean the opposite, in fact. I mean, the healthcare reform looks very likely, I think, to get through early next week or this weekend. And I think Obama will want to be in Washington to help spin the story, to say that this was the most monumental change since 1965 in healthcare reform. So it would look strange if he was overseas when he'd achieved something which he'll suggest is an enormous achievement for his party, the Democratic Party.
Win or lose, though, has Barack Obama been damaged by this fight?
I don't think so. I think if it comes through, I mean, the Republicans will say that tactics we used, which were unparliamentary or not collegial as they should have been, it's certainly not a bipartisan bill. It's going to be totally a Democrats' bill. But I think this will be something that Obama will campaign on next time round as one of his major triumphs. I mean, it will be in the top three if it gets through this weekend for sure.
If your prediction doesn't come true, if it doesn't get through, some are even saying this could signal the end of his presidency.
It will be disastrous. I mean, it would be a major sort of confidence dent for his administration. I mean, it is the Congress's bill, but he's been very much behind it. He's been putting a lot of input into it. So I think it would just take a lot of the wind out of the sails. He's in some ways fortunate that his opponents don't seem to have a candidate who's really sort of at the first rate or at the first class at the moment. So he might benefit by the weakness of the Republican Party, but it will do a lot of damage to his agenda, to his confidence indeed.
What's your assessment of the presidency so far? You know, many commentators in America are saying there is a sense of disillusionment now with Obama and his party.
Well, the expectations were so great when he came in. The expectations that this was going to be a new type of politician, that it was going to be the end of the Bush era and a new type of politics was going to come to Washington. That was probably always unlikely. Politics is always going to be fractious and there's always going to be large issues which people disagree over. So I think he probably was a little inexperienced in the way he suggested he maybe could achieve more than he was going to be able to in his first year. He suggested he would be able to achieve healthcare reform, I think, earlier than he has been able to achieve it. But I think maybe he's having a stronger year this year. There are, I think, some signs that this year may be better than last year, and I think it's far too early to write him off, indeed.
Okay. Let's talk about what it means for Australia and in terms of our diplomatic and perhaps trade ties with the United States. If the President does have a longer visit rather than 24 hours, perhaps with his wife and children, and manages to take in some of the sites in Australia, what are the implications of that for ties between both countries?
I think too much can be made of that. I think there's a slightly gushy element to Australian commentary on presidential visits, on Obama's proposed visit. The notion that if his wife and children come, this tells us something about the alliance being in a good state, I think is a worry. That this is the language of dating being used for the language of international politics, and these two things, I think, are best kept separate. We don't want to sound too desperate in our want to have leaders here. We're probably better off to look at the bigger issues, the trade issues, the Afghanistan war, and think about our national interest rather than think about, well, does the President really love us if he wants to bring his family here?
How would you describe the relationship between Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and the US President?
I think Prime Minister Rudd likes to talk it up. There's obviously some connection there, some common issues. The issue of global warming is one that they've obviously having a reasonably common position on, or at least a sympathy to want to do something on that issue. But I think that could be overplayed, and I think Prime Minister Rudd probably will have to be careful when Obama comes, if it's around an election time, not to overplay the sense of being close to the President.
There was some talk in the lead-up to the presidential election that if Barack Obama got in, it would perhaps not be the best thing for Australian industry, in that he has a tougher stand in terms of subsidies and import restrictions. Do you think this is going to be on the list of conversations when he visits the country?
His party, the Democratic Party, definitely has elements which are more protectionist within that party. I think Obama himself is probably more of a tending towards a free trade position, but there are elements in his party which would be pushing for certain trade, limitations. Australia's probably fortunate that this free trade agreement that it has probably gives it some degree of control over what might happen. Other nations maybe aren't as well protected as Australia in that regard. But this is a very technical area, and it would depend, I think, on the particular industry that we were talking about.